2011. It was
Yes.
a really good year for us in Salesforce.com land. Lots of cool things we did. It was our first year where we actually had user adoption. They had been exposed to Salesforce.com right from the get-go, understood what they were using and how to use it. We launched Salesforce in August of 2010. So, you know, we were several months into it, and people were starting to get their feet under them. And so we decided, you know, we now have our base functionality and we're going to start implementing some things and doing some cool stuff. So we enabled some features.
Yes.
What did we do? What kind of things did we turn on there?
Well, one of the big ones for end users was we enabled Chatter, and that the adoption on that was great. People picked up on it real quick and seemed to like it and are using it well. We also implemented territories and the forecasting stuff, so that we could get some forecasting within Salesforce, which we were previously kind of doing funnel management and that outside. What else did we do? We implemented, or we did a review of our security model in there in terms of our sharing settings and all that. That was kind of driven by the fact that we integrated what was previously 3 Salesforce organizations down into 1. We did some Visualforce work to improve some of our workflows for people doing new prospecting, to get some screens that were more in line with their sales process. So yeah, we did a few things.
Yeah, we also we enabled cases as well.
Yes,
too.
we did.
We had some support processes that weren't being tracked anywhere really.
Right. There were
prior to this.
Some spreadsheets, some not. Email mostly.
Yeah.
So we enabled cases to really allow our customer service, research, and sales departments to keep a full back to front, have a full back to front picture of how all that was working. And
we wrote some really cool Apex custom sharing rules that you loved.
Oh, those were wonderful.
Those are great. So we enabled a bunch of features. But coming into like the sort of the second quarter of the year, we had a bunch of pain points. Things that we were trying to address sort of from like February on to say August or September. They fell fairly well into three categories. One was release management, the other one was testing, and finally some integration stuff. So in that time frame, what were sort of the pain points we had with release management?
Well, release management, we had a few issues with release management, starting from the developers moving all the way through to people trying to actually do releases, right? So we have a relatively large number of developers who are working in Salesforce on a day-to-day basis. And going into the second quarter, we had everybody working out of a single development sandbox. And so every now and then we'd run into scenarios where the change detection that the Eclipse plugin does wouldn't work perfectly, and you'd have people overwriting changes. So that was one of our issues. The other was we haven't been successful in using version control, really. The Eclipse Subversion plugin was causing us more problems, really, than it was helping with. And so that was one of the things that we were trying to work with. And then also going beyond QA, getting from QA to production was another issue. So, because a lot of the times we have maybe a dozen tickets in QA, but only half of those are going to end up in production. And so we have the issue of sitting there trying to cherry pick out the bits of code that pertained to a particular feature that was going to go without accidentally pulling in code from one of the features that was staying, and that was a really manual process that took time.
So what did we do to try and address that?
Well, the first thing we did was we took that single development sandbox and moved everybody out of it so that everybody was working in their own sandboxes, and then just pushing their features into that one development sandbox when they were done.
How did that go?
Not well. That made things worse because we ran into all sorts of issues. So people still had to do that whole cherry picking thing where they copying and pasting the code that they changed into that and making sure they weren't overwriting something that was different. Coordinating refreshes of those sandboxes was a pain. You can only refresh the various types of sandboxes every certain number of days. So keeping that all coordinated and stuff was...
And having that in a consistent point where, you know, you can only refresh a sandbox from a production org. So you have changes sitting in QA or the development
Yeah.
sandbox. How do we refresh from production and at what point?
Yeah, so that really just made things a whole lot worse, I think. And we ended up right back where we started with using that single development sandbox.
Testing.
Yeah,
Testing.
Everyone's favorite topic.
It is our favorite topic. What was the challenge with testing?
Well, I think the challenge we had was probably a good challenge. You know, we have a lot of tests, and as a result, they take a long time to run.
How long would you say?
Right now, we're sitting about an hour and a half, I think, to do a full test run, which means that our deployments to production are taking a minimum of an hour and a half, assuming everything goes right the first time.
And they always do.
Oh, absolutely. They're perfect. We certainly have never spent entire days trying to get code into production.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So I think that just time for our testing was kind of our biggest pain point, and I think a lot of that was tied to the way we were coding.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And integration. Integration is a favorite topic of mine. I love this topic. So initially, when we first launched Salesforce.com, with our website being Rails, Salesforce.com, these two systems share a lot of data. And so we have integration going on, and our initial implementation was rough.
It was. It was functional.
It worked.
But it wasn't elegant, really.
Right. Go over it a little bit. What did we do?
So we've got basically a Windows service sitting in between our website and Salesforce that sits there and polls for changes to data in Salesforce, pushes across into the web, and then on the web side we had the active Salesforce adapter doing basically the same thing. When certain data changed in the web, it would push it over to Salesforce.
Okay.
And that both pieces kind of caused us some problems.
Actually, I think you got a little ahead of us because initially we actually had a .NET web service we called, right?
We did, yes, that's true.
Did.
I skipped that.
Yes, yeah, you tried to forget about it.
I did, yes.
But our second iteration, once we got beyond that and we decided that we want to do something better, we moved on to the active Salesforce SOAP adapter. And this is using the SOAP API in Salesforce. Mike Halliday found this gem, and we implemented it as our initial integration with Salesforce.
Yep.
Now it had some challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about it since I was on that implementation team. Had challenges with authentication. If Salesforce went into maintenance, it would basically fail making calls to Salesforce and wouldn't elegantly recover from that.
Yep.
And so we'd have issues there. It didn't expose all of our custom objects fairly well. A lot of our objects weren't actually available to us through the SOAP adapter, and it also did some interpreting, I should say. It did some interpreting of field names and converted them so that they were more usable in Rails. But that made it difficult to look at a field that was inside Rails and know what you were using inside Salesforce.com. So we had these challenges with this adapter. Now the integration worked for the most part, but we had challenges.
Yeah.
So come to the end of August, we're getting fairly frustrated with some of these things.
Yes. Yeah, we'd been kind of wrestling with a few of them for a fair bit of time and hadn't been able to come up with anything that we liked, really.
Yeah. So we went off to Dreamforce. And how was Dreamforce for you?
It was a lot of fun for me. It was my first time in San Francisco, so that was kind of cool. But I know I learned a lot. There were a lot of good sessions where we picked up a lot of tips and tricks, which we were able to come back and apply to some of these pain points we were having. You know, there were a lot of good Apex kind of patterns and stuff that we picked up on that we've implemented. A couple other tools, so the database.com adapter, the Brain Engine IDE, and then a release management tool.
So the focus of Dreamforce this year was all about social enterprise.
It was, yep.
How did that? What did we do with that? You know, we came away from Dreamforce. I mean, I know I did at least. Came away from Dreamforce feeling like, wow, this is great. What did we do with that?
Chatter. We got it turned on finally. For months leading up to Dreamforce anyways, I know we'd been talking about doing it and kind of joking that, hey, we should just click the button now. But there was some hesitation from some people, worried that it was going to negatively impact people's productivity, that it would be more of a distraction than a benefit, really. But what we really got from Dreamforce in terms of chatter was that everybody who went there came out saying, you know, this is something we should turn on. And it sparked that discussion when we got back.
Right.
That really led to us getting it turned on in the past couple months.
Right, right. Another thing that we got out of Dreamforce as well is there were a bunch of really cool Apex things you alluded to.
Yep.
Database.com was one example of the gem.
Mm-hmm.
How was the database.com gem important to us?
Well, it meant that it was one step towards revamping kind of all of our integrations. It solved a lot of the problems that the previous adapter that we were using had. And so when we got back, I think almost immediately, we took a couple people and had them go off and start investigating what it was going to take to implement it. And then they started.
Right.
And it took a little while, but we've now completely replaced the previous active Salesforce adapter with that database.com gem.
Right. And what was really reassuring about that adapter was that the shortcomings that it had when we started in the implementation were quickly addressed by the community.
They were, yeah.
You know, it didn't initially deal with the re-authentication of the credentials when Salesforce went into maintenance mode. That was addressed in the adapter fairly quickly, and there were a few others that we went back to the community, and those were addressed really.
They were, yeah.
Quickly turned around. How did Dreamforce help us with release management? This one, I love this one.
I know, this was cool. So I think it was you were at a session, and
I think I texted you in that session.
You
I was
did.
sitting there and I was like, you know, Liam, this is it, man. This is what we need.
You did. So we heard about Red Hat's tool that they had just released called Stratosource for doing release management, for tracking changes that happened in Salesforce or in Salesforce sandboxes, allowing you to tag those changes, associate them with user stories or tickets, and do all that through kind of a nice web interface, which really helped that issue of, hey, we've got 5 different features sitting in QA, but we're only releasing 3 of them. What code goes with which? And so we came back, we've turned that on, we've started using it, and I think it's really helped. It's really helped us.
Yes, for sure. And we also discovered the Brain Engine IDE.
Yep.
That seems fairly, from the ground up, it was built specifically to integrate with Salesforce and allow you to manage code.
It was.
Fairly elegant, has its own little...
It's got some quirks
about it, but
yeah.
For the most part, I prefer it way more than I do Eclipse. So.
Yeah, definitely. I've started using it, and we just kind of stumbled across that one as a side note on one of the talks. I think one of the talks was being given by the guy who wrote it on something completely unrelated.
Right.
And he was just using it for the talk, and we thought, hey, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I threw the note down in my iPhone or iPad and got back to the office, and I had to check out what Brain Engine was.
Yeah, it kind of integrates a lot of those various tasks that you do, so you don't have to jump from Eclipse out to the data loader over to viewing your schema. It's all pulls it together, so it's kind of nice.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so we got some really good stuff for integration from Dreamforce. We got some really good stuff for release management. Testing.
Yes.
Testing. We still have these hour-and-a-half deployments.
We do.
Right now we do. But what's the positive outlook on this that came out of Dreamforce?
Well, so this is where some of those kind of cool Apex patterns that we saw come into play. One of the talks, one of the patterns that was outlined was effectively taking your code and isolating the logic from your triggers, moving it off into a class that not only has the logic, but is able to execute that logic in any of the different contexts, whether it be a batch, a future method, or a trigger. And so I think that's kind of the key to getting our code testable in a way that doesn't take hours. So we've started doing that. So we've started pulling our logic out of our triggers, which is where most of it was up until this point, and isolating it off into some methods that we can test. So true unit tests, instead of having to actually create data, insert it, wait for our triggers to fire, and make sure those triggers are acting properly. We can create some records, and without ever committing them to the database, we can make sure our logic's working properly, which is where we're really going to see that speed increase in our tests. Because I know you did some kind of quick benchmarks, and a surprising amount of the time that it takes for our tests to run is in the actual inserting of our data.
Right. Yeah. It was quite surprising to see, like out of an hour and a half. It was something quite substantial that, perhaps, 25 minutes of that time was just inserting, updating, manipulating data in some way.
And that was only going to get worse as we add more and more logic into our triggers.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So there was a lot of interesting stuff we took out of there. I know we also had some reporting patterns that we brought back that helped do some analytics and whatnot. I think all in all, everything that we've done over the past year, the experience and the things that we have found at Dreamforce and we've brought back, and really positioned us to be in a good spot for the coming year.
Yeah, I think so. We've made a lot of changes over the past few months that are really getting us into a good position to kind of get our code base from a technical perspective cleaned up and keep us able to move forward quickly.
Yeah. So it was a good year all around.
It was.